And we're live. Okay, I'm excited. Welcome back again to another Mind Meld PR vlog. I am your host, Jonathon Narvey, the founder of Mind Meld PR. And today I'm excited. I have a special guest with me, Tyler Orton, the technology reporter. I messed that up. The technology reporter for Business in Vancouver. Welcome, Tyler.
Hey, thanks. You even got a little shout out to my Twitter handle, which is also @Reportin as well. So I like it.
Oh, perfect. Okay. I will take that. Thank you. You're very gracious. So for those who have been watching the show already, this is going to be a continuation of the talk that I had a few weeks back with Farhan Mohammed from Daily Hive about how to get reporters to tell your story, which is a pretty important thing when you're doing media relations. This is part two. And just a little bit of context. This is actually, we were supposed to do this in person before the world collapsed, but this is, now we're back. I guess before we get going, Tyler, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background as a reporter?
Yeah, I started at Business in Vancouver 6 years ago as initially their general assignment and doing a lot of the web editing work. And then slowly got moved, or I should say quickly got moved over to the technology desk when we had a bit of a reshuffling there. And I've been a contributor at Global Morning Show for their business hits, 6:45 in the morning. I've been doing that for 6 years as well. I'm also the editor of Digital Health Magazine, which is a sister publication for Business in Vancouver too. So yeah, I've got my fingers in a whole number of different pies, but I should also mention, in addition to technology, I also cover the film and TV sector, VFX, animation, what have you, as well as just the economy at large. Yeah, I like to just see what's kicking in all parts of the BC economy for myself.
So what you're telling me is you're basically running Business in Vancouver on your own.
I want somebody to tell my boss that. Maybe I can use that for some sort of salary negotiation. But I've got a great team that I work with, and nothing would work if we had one person or two people missing at any given time. It really is a team effort there.
Very good, very good. I do notice you get a ton of bylines though. So sometimes it does seem like it's sort of resting on your shoulders, but it's very gracious of you to share the compliments around. Okay, so let's just get right into it. How to get a reporter to tell your story. I guess this boils down to, Tyler, what am I doing wrong?
Well, I don't know if there's anybody doing anything wrong or anything like that. Right now, we had a pandemic, I'd say for, 4 to 6 weeks, all of our bandwidth was at max capacity and then some. And so maybe some emails from a lot of PR people may have slipped through the cracks. So it's always good to maybe follow up with a report if you don't hear back from immediately. I would say generally, if it's maybe the second or third time rounds, maybe the reporter just knows they don't have a bandwidth to respond to everybody. It's probably not going to be the best fit for them. But I think for the most part, I always try to get back to somebody just to let them know what might work, what might not work for us.
Yeah, I've noticed that about you. You actually go a bit above and beyond what I've seen other reporters do. And maybe this just comes from your experience, but you seem to be a bit more of a long-term planner. So for example, there have been times in the past where I've pitched you on a story and you'll say something like, I don't see a good fit for it this week, but actually I know that we're going to be looking at this kind of a story in a few months. And so just your knowledge of the publishing schedule gives you the opportunity to maybe give a more nuanced response.
Well, I'll tell you what, a lot of times what happens is somebody will pitch me something that it's just not quite the right fit for Business in Vancouver. We're very much like a West Coast B2B centric sort of publication. Sometimes that means we've got a very narrow sort of avenue for what we want to cover. But I see that there's maybe like a kernel of something there. I can work with it, or at least use somebody in there as an expert for another potential story going down the road. I'll give you an example of that. Somebody's been contacting me, I'd say last 2 or 3 months, about a cool technology company here in Metro Vancouver, and it's never quite been right for the kinds of stories that I want to tackle. But lo and behold, I was doing stories about VFX and animation. I'm working on it right now. And I realized that this company is doing a lot to facilitate what they're doing. So I've had this in my files, and I reached out to the company just a few hours ago, set up an interview. I'm going to be speaking to them soon as well. So even if something's not working in that immediate moment, at least for me, I feel as if there's going to be potential for me tapping into the minds of much smarter people using their expertise. And that's what we really like to do. Because the other thing that I'll put forward though is, I think the editors definitely value kind of the enterprise sorts of stories. I do a lot of breaking news. So there'd be like press releases where, this is happening right now. I love jumping on those. It's always good to get a quick soundbite or two from whoever I'm speaking to. But we also have to think about the print product, which is also a very different product than what you would see with regards to just the online stuff. All of our print stories obviously go online, but the online stuff is geared more towards the breaking news, and the print product is more geared towards the broader industry trends and a lot more of the evergreen stuff. Although we've had to make a lot of adjustments to the way that we think and strategize with regards to the newspaper, just as a result of the pandemic. Because what might be news one week, it's going to be covered by a whole plethora of different news agencies, news outlets, by the time that it goes to print, maybe 8 or 9 days later.
You've covered a few pieces there that I wanted to dig into. Can you explain the difference for companies that may be doing PR internally, or they're outsourcing and they're just getting started with the process? What's the difference between breaking news and evergreen news?
Yeah, so I would say the evergreen stuff, does it make us need to step back and take a second look on a broader trend, something that might recontextualize, in our case, the economic or the corporate landscape? So, and is something going to hold for a lot longer? Will our interest be sparked by it if we somehow uncover an old newspaper, 3 weeks after it's been published? You read the story and you're like, okay, so it's fascinating. I now understand why, for example, mining industry is having a tough time in British Columbia right now, versus an announcement that says this company has been given approval to move forward with its plans for a mine. That's the what. And I think what we want to do in the newspaper, so I would say, yeah, online is the what. And with the newspaper, we're talking about the so what and the now what, if that kind of breaks it down to a certain degree.
Yeah, I think that breaks it down quite well. I think that's something that I struggle with, that clients and many companies struggle with, is how to maybe make something super timely for you, because we're trying to make this a win-win kind of a thing. Like, we have news, you make the news, let's get together. So we're trying to think like a reporter. Maybe, do you have any other tips for, helping let's say someone's preparing a pitch and they're not sure, is this really timely? What is a sign that something is super timely for you?
Well, it has to do, I think, a lot with the way the pitch is delivered as well. Because what I can get into what you're asking me about, but I'll say first off, oftentimes I have to read through the pitch, and we call it, and I think it's a common term, but we call it burying the lead. And oftentimes the pitches will be a lot of context up high, and then they finally get to the news hook further down into the story. And I think I would recommend pushing the news hook right up to the top and then offer context to the reporter from there, because that timeliness aspect, I think that's what we're always on the look for, is what is the news hook? Why is this worth covering right now? Why could this have the potential for more stories down the road? So if you have that news hook up high, that'll be good for us as well. with regards to the timeliness aspect, that's like trying to describe to somebody who has never had the ability to smell anything before, like what does something smell like? It's kind of tough to point your finger right at it, but you kind of know it when it happens. But I would say that think about the relevancy to readers. Are readers concerned with a certain aspect right now? I think everybody's concerned with the pandemic, but if you're sending me a pitch with regards to a company that is deciding, hey, we're going to close down our doors as a result of the pandemic, I think that story is from 2 months ago. I think what we want to think about now is how are companies bouncing back from the pandemic. So there's kind of a timeline that people have to be aware of about what's going to be timely for us as we write it, timely for us as we publish it, and maybe timely for readers if they pick up the newspaper or one of our magazines, maybe a couple weeks or months down the road. So it's a bit of I would say it's more of an art than a science, honestly.
That's fair. That's fair. And I think one thing that ties into this whole idea of breaking news being timely is the tactic of using an embargo. And I know that different reporters will have opinions about how embargoes are used. So the basic concept is, and I think there are different iterations of this. The basic idea is you've got a story that's fairly big, and you want to make sure that you get some coverage for it. Maybe you have a relationship with a reporter that you trust, and you're sort of giving up the opportunity to mass blast every reporter on your list for you're trying to get a certainty of essentially a promise of coverage out of a reporter. If this is the news that's coming out I'm hoping you can put this out in your edition in the next 48 hours, but please don't go live with it before then. But you're the only reporter I'm telling this. So that's basically, it's pretty simple, but maybe can you talk about your experience with embargoes, how they work?
Yeah, and then just from my own experience, because there's kind of the distinction between an exclusive and then an embargo as well. And I've got no issue if somebody wants to say, hey, this announcement is embargoed to Wednesday or something like that. Are you available to maybe talk to the CEO or a VP about what's going on? I assume that they're making this offer to other publications as well. I've got no issue with that. That actually helps me out because it gives me time, it gives me notice. My mornings are quite busy. So if I have the foreknowledge that I could get some copy written and ready for our website in time for when the embargo's up, that's great to me. I lovely. Can't say that enough. Sometimes issues come up with promises of exclusives, and I think you need to consider what you're ultimately trying to do that as a PR professional. Like, is it about eyeballs? Is it about the audience who's going to be getting the exclusive? I'm on the other side of it, so I honestly can't speak to that. For me, I've had situations where somebody promised me an interview, and then they came back and said, oh, I'm sorry, one of my colleagues promised an exclusive to another publication. And that's frustrating. And it also kind of harms the relationship that you might have with a reporter. And you have to kind of determine whether or not you want to figure out what both publications should be doing in that situation, or maybe you have to have a discussion with both publications at that point. I would say that reneging on a promise of an interview with a reporter, one of the last things that people should be doing. Like, that's just my own personal feeling. So,
just on a very tactical basis, like how far in advance do you typically see these embargoed media requests?
Yeah, I see. Well, actually, I've gotten them as early as like, hey, this goes live in about 12 hours, which that's not super helpful. But I would say generally speaking, 2 days to maybe 5 days. I would also say that I wouldn't recommend giving somebody like, hey, 2 weeks notice. I think that's actually too much time. Reporters are very much like in the now, like what is going on right now? What are my top priorities right now? It's really difficult for me to plan anything 2 weeks in advance, like really difficult. I would say it's best for me if you're giving me about 3 days notice. Like it's still top of mind. I still have the urgency to get it done. We have enough time for me to finish whatever responsibilities I might have already. I can then organize an interview and then get the writing done. That's just kind of my own personal preference.
Hmm. Well, perfect. I think we covered that, and then I think just going to the subject matter of how to target certain reporters for certain kinds of stories. This came up in the conversation with Farhan actually, where um, I have a kind of a perverse situation happening where I want to target the exact reporter for the exact kind of story that I want, but I'm getting results where I actually find I'm more successful, and this may be just our agency. I don't know. Maybe it's my relationships. When I pitch the editor and then just rely on them to assign out the story, it seems to have a better effect. And maybe I just haven't cultivated my relationships enough with the beat reporters who are covering specific topics. Maybe could you speak to the interplay in the between the editor and individual reporters and how that works in terms of how stuff gets assigned?
Well, it might be just particular to BIV that I can speak to because the team here, we have very delineated beats. So I would say that you would have more success targeting a specific reporter for my publication, just because I'm never going to take on a retail story, for example. It's unlikely that my one of my assigning editors would give me that. They would send it over to the other reporter anyways. So you just might be jumping through other hoops. If those situations do arrive, or maybe you do have more success with an editor versus a reporter. Maybe it's just the editor is like, oh, well, this seems interesting. I don't know much about it. I'll give this to the reporter to do. Whereas the reporter might have enough knowledge about it that it's not quite within what they usually cover, and they'll kind of blanch at it to a certain degree. That's my best guess. But
Mm.
I don't know. For the most part, if you can target a reporter, I think that's actually your best bet because you're going to be getting somebody who's actually 100% involved with the story. Like they are on board with what's going on here. They have the context. They know the backgrounds. They are invested in talking to this person. I think you're going to get a better quality story out of that reporter if you're pitching directly to them as well.
Hmm. That's great. I wanted to cover the kinds of topics that get covered, and this is a bit of a nebulous question, so I'm going to ask in a different way, because if I just say, "Hey, what are some hot topics in tech?" Like you could go on forever. I think that maybe a better way to do this is like I'm sure compared with the number of pitches you accept, there's a lot of pitches that get rejected for various reasons. And so I'm speaking in terms of the newsworthiness. Can you maybe speak to some pitches that, and obviously, please don't mention any companies that sent you any releases, including mine, that maybe didn't quite make the mark. What was common to these stories that just the news factor wasn't there, or what wasn't working?
Well, I'll just tell you because we're a B2B publication,
Mm,
we get a lot of product launch pitches, and
mm,
that's not what our audience is about. That's more for a consumer oriented sort of publication. So it's generally the product launch pitches. And what I'll often do though is like, okay, I'm not interested in covering the launch of your new software platform or what have you, but I see that you might be onto something that's interesting. There's like a trend here, like a broader trend that I can sink my teeth into. So stand by, and as I alluded to earlier in our discussion, there might be something, you know, a few days down the road or a few weeks down the road where I might have time to circle back on to that company and do that there. There's the other pitches where it's, I wonder if the person has asked themselves, what is the benefit going to be to this reporter's audience? I can totally understand if a company had a very flattering profile written all about them, what the benefit is to the company. I don't know what the benefit is to our readers, though. And I think that's something that needs to be considered. It's readers first, and then find a way to work in the company after that. You know, it might not be the focus on the company that matters, but maybe the focus on the broader trend that the company can address. And I think it's a matter of recalibrating how you really actually pitch that to the reporter. I also understand, like in a lot of cases, maybe the company needs to sign off on what exactly the pitch is going to entail, and the company might have some notes here or there, but I would still say that, doesn't the company want to be, you know, featured? You know, I think that should be the number one consideration, and you're going to have more success with that if you're thinking first about the audience and then about what the company can inform the audience about.
Yeah, that's all good advice. I want to latch on to something you were talking about there, just about the, you know, making sure the pitch is the right fit for the audience, and so providing that context in the pitch. You know, a lot of companies will just put together a press release, and it's just the subject line is the title of the release, and the you know, all the text for the release is in there, but they kind of skip the actual pitch to the reporter. I always try to throw in a couple lines of number one, you know, hey Tyler, I know you were writing about XYZ, or you were covering this, so you know, I'm trying to build a context of, I know what you cover, or prove that I understand, you know, what you're interested in, to, you know, that I think you're interested in. So it's, you know, introduction. Hey, I think this is in your wheelhouse. Here is the top line thing, the one thing that I think is gonna make this story. That's it. I don't want to provide any more context than that, because, you know, it's diminishing returns. Maybe you can give me some idea to how to do effective pitching with you or anyone else.
Yeah, you know, number one, if you can summarize everything in the subject line, much like reporters have to do that in a headline, that is great. Because I often get pitches where I look at the subject line in the email and I have no idea what the pitch is about. It's like, you never want to be in that situation. So think about the subject line first. If you can do that in just a few sentences, think about, I don't know, the noun, the verb, think about the who, what, when, where, why, that sort of stuff. I know, probably easier said than done, but that's the first step there. Yeah, like you said, about kind of the introduction, alerting the reporter that you're familiar about why it might be of interest to them. Keep that, you alluded to it, keep that as short as possible. I'm usually interested in jumping right into the release, seeing what the quote unquote news is, and I can go through the details in there as well after I review the release. And then I can go back to the top of the message if there's other pleasantries exchanged. What pops out to me when I get a pitch, though, is if there's some sort of like tangible thing going on. I often get requests, hey, do you want to speak to this CEO about this industry? And I'm always like, well, I don't know, that you're making me do a lot of work to carve out time in my day. I don't exactly know what it is that I'll get out of this. I don't exactly know if the CEO is going to make for a good interview. This could go on for 20 minutes and I could walk away with it with nothing. If you can get into specifics, like early on, and say, this expert in this subject wants to tell you something specifically about this topic, and maybe what they have to say goes against the grain, I think that is something that's going to grab me right away. Another thing is, yeah, those tangible elements, like, is this company raising capital? Is this company opening a new office? Is this company hiring 100 people? Those are the things that will grab me, as well as data, numbers, stuff that I can point to within the story that kind of provides a sense of scale. Like, and I kind of said it right there with maybe a capital raise. Well, that's a number that provides scale. A number of employees that they want to hire, that again offers scale. So it's those kinds of things where it's one thing for a CEO to just kind of speak in platitudes about how great it is to be based in Vancouver, and cost of living is expensive, but we have to balance that off with proper salaries for workers. I've heard that from everybody. I've heard that a million times. Why don't you come in and tell me that you guys need to stop whining? Vancouver is cheapest place to live. We pay people more than you get in like central London. That might be like totally goofy, but not a lot of people are saying that. Like, that's going to grab my attention as well. Like, if you're going against the grain, because I'll say this, like, my experience interviewing Canadians, especially here in Vancouver, we're a small city. I think we're very polite. Oftentimes people are more reserved, and they would rather speak candidly when the mics are off. And I totally understand that, but I also speak to a lot of Americans. There's a lot of American expats living in Canada. They are candid. Doesn't matter if they're in business or not. They will tell you what's on their mind. I really do appreciate that. I honestly think that it is a cultural thing to a certain degree. I'm somebody, I am Canadian, but I did grow up down in Seattle. So I can kind of recognize that difference between the two countries. And I love it if somebody is willing to be candid and just kind of spell things out for me. And I think there's not that much to fear. I really don't think there's going to be some big reprisal if you have some sort of critique about some sort of policy that was laid out by government or an industry association or the whatnot. I really think that people would rather have diversity of opinion than some sort of monolithic sort of groupthink that's going on.
Yeah. Well, it comes back to I can't remember if it was Malcolm Gladwell. I'm sure I'm not the first guy to say this, but boring is risky. You need to be, maybe not edgy, but at least a little contentious, definitely original, or else you get into something. I have a concept around just polluting the commons or polluting the internet. Like, I think of the internet as this vast reservoir of all human knowledge, and so I see a lot of stories, not so much in news outlets, but on people's blogs, which appear to pretty much regurgitate information that I can find in 100 other places. And you're trying to do the opposite of that. If you've got a news organization, originality, having something new in the news is so critical for you.
Yeah, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but I did get a pitch earlier this week, and it didn't really go beyond safety in the workplace and why safety in the workplace is important right now. And I'm like, okay, I mean, but I could get that from anyone. Like, anybody can tell me, like, what is different about what this company or this client is doing than anyone else. And if you're asking me to get on the phone and try to figure that out through like a 15, 20-minute conversation, and maybe I can never figure that out because that novelty factor just isn't there. It's a big ask. And then you also have to wonder, what is your relationship going to be with reporter down the road if that reporter kind of fizzles out with that initial pitch that you gave them, and how willing are they going to be to follow up with you on subsequent pitches? So that's another thing to keep in mind. But yeah, that novelty factor that you mentioned, that I just mentioned, that's another thing. Like I said, I don't usually do product launches, but if there's a novelty factor, if it's something like pretty cool, some tech company is about to, I don't know, build a hover car in Vancouver, I'll do a hover car story. Those are the kinds of things that might make me go against what I usually do as well. So it's really that novelty factor that I think also pops out to a lot of reporters too.
We've mentioned already a few times building that relationship with the reporter, and it's something I love to do. I'm an outgoing guy, but at the same time, well, I guess I should provide a little context. Like when people tend to hire a PR company, one of the first questions they'll ask is, "So, do you have relationships with reporter? Who are you connected to?" And I usually tell them something like, look, if you've been working in this industry for 6 months, or probably less than that, you have some relationships already. But a relationship doesn't guarantee you a story. It just guarantees you an extra maybe 5 seconds. That's assuming
I'd say
you
that's accurate. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, you recognize my email, and you might not always be looking at that, but if you do see that, you might read a few extra lines.
Yeah. The other thing is I often will say or get invitations. Hey, do you want to grab a cup of coffee? There's an event going on. There's going to be a dinner there. Do you want to do this? I don't have time. Like I can't emphasize that enough. For reporters, I'd say for 98% of reporters, they just don't have time to go grab a coffee for an hour, potentially get a story, but maybe not out of it, or get story ideas or not. Because a lot of what we're doing, especially during this pandemic, it's a lot of breaking news right now. And even before that, like, I don't think anybody's going to grab a cup of coffee during a pandemic, but I would say the relationships for me, a lot of it is just how much I can depend on somebody. If I reach out to them and I'll say, hey, do you have an expert who can speak to that? Or, hey, remember that person that you put me in touch with a couple weeks ago? Are they available in like the next 5 minutes? If there's kind of a quick back and forth, if I know that they're going to be on top of everything, I would call that like a really good relationship. And oftentimes that means that they'll be reaching out to me and say, hey, I've got a story that I think is a good fit. I'll float it to you first. And if it's not a good fit, then I'll float it to somebody else afterwards. But that's kind of how I think of kind of the relationship in this business.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you touched on that aspect of the company needing to make sure that the spokesperson is actually available. That has bitten me in the ass before, where I'll pitch something, and the worst case was it's happened a few years. Well, not just a few years ago, but anyways, I pitched a reporter, major magazine in the tech space. It was exactly what we wanted. We were going to get a huge feature on our product, and it was exactly what we wanted. And so I mentioned this to the VP of, I can't remember what their exact title was, but our CEO wasn't around that minute, and they were like, nope, we can't do this right now. I'm like, well, what? I sent out the release. I got what we wanted. He's got to talk. It's like, no, we're going to need questions in advance, and we want to massage our talking points. Let's give it a couple days. I'm like, oh God.
Reporters don't go for that. I can tell you, so maybe, it's an opportunity for some people in PR to just set realistic expectations for clients, especially when it comes to what they have to manage with reporters' expectations. I often have people say, well, can you send all your questions in advance? And I'm just like, I rarely have like a long list of questions that I've pre-written and that I've got like beats in my head that I definitely want to ask them about. Also, it doesn't really make for a good interview if somebody has all these questions that they have in advance and then they're just reading in monotone off them. Like that's a pretty painful interview. You don't really get good material out of it. And it's not like these reporters are trying to get these gotcha questions out of people. They just want some authenticity, and they want some candidacy from people as well. So those are the things to consider. I'll also say, hey, is so-and-so available? And they're like, no, they're not. I'm like, okay, well, is somebody else from the organization able to speak to that? I don't need to necessarily speak to the CEO of a company, tell us that they've got like tons of VPs that I've spoken to rather than the CEO, Darren Entwistle. So I'm totally happy to do with that because these people know their stuff. I'd rather get like people that are super, super knowledgeable about every little detail about one specific thing than somebody who might only be able to address things with regards to broad strokes. So I'm just there to get the best information out to the readers.
Totally, totally. So, this comes down to, not just making sure the CEO is able to talk, but, and this is part of actually what a PR person has to do is get their team involved. And so after that debacle I told you about, I changed my method of, I made sure everyone who should be on the same page was on the same page, and everyone was prepped. And, if it's a story about, if it's a story about a product launch or how the product is being developed, the CMO needs to have something to say there. If it's something to do with how they're implementing AI in their organization in a totally leading edge way that no one else is doing, that's probably going to go to their CTO or some technical person who needs to be able to speak not just in technical terms. That person actually needs to be able to speak like a human being, which is can be tricky in certain organizations and in certain roles. It's like I'm not saying everyone needs to be a communication expert. And that's part of my role actually, is to help prepare people to speak in a way that's going to be helpful for people like you.
Well, I appreciate that because, okay, so I've got two things that I'm dealing with. The business sector, which they use a lot of jargon in business,
Mm.
like they don't often speak the way that we would in just everyday life. And then within that, you've got the tech sector, which he uses even more bizarre jargon. I don't know. Let's say you're expecting a child. In real life, somebody would say, "Hey, I'm expecting a daughter." Maybe in the tech industry, they'll be like, "I'm scaling up my family." It's like nobody actually speaks like that. And I think you need to think about translating, that tech speak, that business speak into the way that people just speak in everyday life. And I think I would love to quote people, but I realize I have to paraphrase oftentimes just to actually like break it down, get rid of this jargon, um, like because it's meaningless to anyone who works outside those specific walls of the tech industry or the business sector. And we do have a broader, like a broad readership, but it's also, it's lawyers are going to be reading our newspaper as well. They don't necessarily know what you're talking about if you're using a lot of the kind of this technology industry jargon too.
Hmm. I'm glad you brought that up because, or followed up, because this happens on our end. We'll have, let's say, clients who are so stoked for their new product or their new thing coming out, and they want to list off details like 12 different bullet points that I know there's two or three that you will be interested in. And so, part of our role is, training up people who are not experts in media relations and communications. And that's why they work with folks like us is, we're trying to help you. First, we have to help them and actually help them help us, because often, PR and marketing people, we're not the most technical people in the room. So we also have to do a lot of homework and background to make sure that, we're getting you actually the most important thing, not just technical details, getting away from features, talking about benefits. I mean, that's, I guess, how I would talk about it in marketing speak, but, getting away from the tiny side details to really what the story is about.
Well, and I think that's important. You bring up how easy it can be for people to skip over maybe the details that might seem very, very important to the client, but I can't tell you how easy it is for a reporter's eyes to kind of glaze over a lot of this stuff if you're getting a 700 word release. I oftentimes will have to scan through it, look for a couple keywords. I often, what will jump out to me is what's sometimes buried in like the quotes that are provided in these releases. And I'm often looking, I mentioned before, I'm often looking for numbers. I'm looking for tangible stuff that's going on here. And I think that's important. But if we're getting into just like, the minutia of little things that are probably not going to matter to the average reader, and I'm talking about the average reader, not the one or two people that might be interested in every tiny little detail, then I think you just, look, shorter is better. Like that's what I have to do. I remember getting into journalism, or back in journalism school. The instructors were like, just shorten your sentences, make your sentences shorter. You don't have to do that flowery writing that you would do for your university essays. Just keep it to the point. And it's still something that, like, I 10 years into the industry, like I still have to just keep things as tight as possible, keep reminding myself, use as few commas as possible, and just that's going to it's going to keep people reading. And that's all you really want them to do. That's what you want to do in PR. That's what we want to do as communicators for broader audiences too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, as you say, it's a key skill as a writer, as a communicator. Chopping out what shouldn't be there, what doesn't need to be there. My senior writer for us calls it the Narvey knives, because I'm merciless. I just chop out whatever isn't absolutely necessary for you. So I think that we've covered a lot of ground here. I'm curious if there's, any other sort of big tip that you wanted to share for, what is something that's going to increase someone's chances of getting you to tell their story.
Yeah, okay, so two things here. I think you're always going to get a reporter's attention if there's some sort of images involved, or if there's, because what we often try to do when we're assigning our photographers assignments is, like, how do we tell the entire story within just an image? If you're able to do that as well in a pitch, it's somebody showcasing their latest, product, or, what have you, I think that's going to grab somebody's attention. Even just a headshot is often helpful. Then I know I'm not going to have to be scrambling for something later on. The other thing that I would also recommend, though, it's in my Twitter bio. I have a direct link to my author page at biv.com. You can find all the stories that I've authored there over the last 6 years. They're all in chronological order, starting with the latest. Get a sense for the kinds of stories that this reporter writes day to day. I often will get pitches that they just don't at all reflect any of the stuff that I write about. And I think you could get a better sense, even if ultimately the story, look, I'm sure I've missed out on some great stories just because I wasn't willing to dig a little deeper through the pitch. But if you can calibrate your pitch towards what the reporter is typically writing about, you're going to have like an even better chance as well.
Mm. This is a lot of advice for me to go into, and I got a few tips from this that I'm definitely going to start using today. So thank you very much, Tyler. This was terrific. Tyler Orton, if people wanted to find out more about you and about business in Vancouver, where could they look for you online?
Yeah, go to biv.com. BIV is in business in Vancouver. Also on Twitter. I said it at the top. I'll say that at the bottom. I'm at Reporton. That's REPORTON. You can find all of my stories there. You can find links to all the stories that I'm interested in as well from the newspaper. So yeah.
Thank you very much again, and it has really genuinely been a pleasure. And for those who have been listening, you've been listening to the Mind Meld PR vlog. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.